So I developed somehow an idea of a free-flowing technology. So that's a kind of a new type of technology where also the relationship between the user and the technology is completely different. But this new technology we cannot use, basically. It always transforms, it always adapts, it always responds to these activities that happens in that now, in that moment.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Light Forest podcast. My name is Dave, and together we go on journeys speaking to changemakers from around the world, exploring how we can bring more light into how we live and regenerate our planet. In today's conversation, we go deep in the woods. We explore the possibility of technology as a medium to expand our consciousness and to navigate our inner worlds. We speak to an artist and technologist, Neel, who has been on such a journey, experimenting with spatial sound as part of a project, Space Sound Syndicate. Through many experiences which he shares through this podcast, he underwent profound realizations, touching parts of himself that he never realized were there, an altered relationship with his body, and ultimately an identity transformation in total, all through experiencing sound. Today, Neel is embarking on a fresh journey as an entrepreneur with the vision of building what he calls free flow technology. Technology for a new paradigm that allows us to navigate our inner worlds, responds to frequency, and doesn't limit you but reveals who you are. Imagine if we lived in a world where technology, rather than making us feel more dense, playing on our desires and fears, opened us up to ourselves and each other and allowed us to feel more expansive and free. This is what Neel envisions and what he's trying to build, and he explains and shares some of his vision with us today. I first met Neel when he participated in a workshop I facilitated through a rather chance event. Speaking to Neel, I felt a lot of resonance and curiosity, while also some incoherence in really understanding what he was talking about. This conversation was a little bit challenging for me as my own mind was trying to play podcast host, looking to grasp and understand and bring coherence. Yet, some of what Neel shares is something he has personally lived and experienced, and some concepts, as we talk about, can only really be experienced rather than talked about. The technology of speak and voice is all we have in a podcast, so we try. Our own conceptions of technology are so limited by our present paradigm. As science fiction author Carl Schroeder says, any sufficient advanced technology may be indistinguishable from nature. They say that the pyramids were a form of technology that allowed the ancients to communicate across many realms. Cosmic divine tools are heard of in many cultures around the world. Devices that help us manipulate energy and interact with subtle realms that are deeper than our five senses. In the non-dual view of life, everything is energy. There is no separation between technology and us. I hope this conversation stimulates and provokes and helps create a picture of a technology future that could come in the light forest paradigm, a paradigm in which we move beyond the very dense five senses way of relating and understand and move into more subtle realms of relating, of understanding, of knowing, with technology playing a role in helping us do this. And before we head into the conversation, if you're listening right now and you haven't subscribed, I would love if you do that on Substack, on YouTube, on any podcast platform that you like to listen to this podcast. Please hit subscribe. It means a lot and it helps me grow this forest for everybody. And with that, let's move into the conversation. welcome Neel Yaz to the Light Forest podcast.
Thank you so much.
Neel, we're standing in the edge of the forest right now, and there are many paths that we can take. And I have a feeling that the paths today will lead us to maybe parts of the forest that I have not been to before. So I'm quite excited. But maybe the first question that comes up to me is we met in Chiang Mai, and you used a symbol on email. In fact, the name that I
Yes.
use for you
Yes.
now isn't even your actual name. It is another sound. Yeah, tell me about that.
Yes.
What's the
Yeah.
story behind that?
Yes. Obviously, when I was born in this body, I got a name like we all do, obviously. And this name I have been carrying with me. I'm actually happy with the name also, but of course, it carries a lot of experiences and carries a lot of things I have been through and things that I've also charging that name with meaning, basically, to a point that I experimented also with identity and also with my own position on this planet, and also like how can we decentralize the name into something more experiential, something more visual, symbolic, which brings images and people can freely interpret it. But that gave also some difficulties. It became a bit like dogmatic, a bit mysterious, hard to grasp. But it was good for a certain period, and definitely for that experiment to see what provokes it, what evokes it. And I think that it was also part of a transition. So this symbol and the transition is between that old name, which I carry since my birth, which I would prefer not to mention because then maybe again people start to relate it with that past. Because I think in my new trajectory, the trajectory I'm now in, Neel Yaz, I want to be clean and fresh. So I also don't create this misconception. And I think these two worlds is quite different dynamic, a different mentality. And therefore, I would say it gives me a bit more space to rebuild, reorient.
So you've been exploring this transition through sound and particularly through a syndicate that you're involved in called Space Sound Syndicate. Yeah, share more with me the work of SSS and how you've been exploring sound and
Mhm.
its relationship with how we understand life and interact with the world around us.
Yeah, I mean, for this, I would also need to scroll back a bit to earlier stage where like because that I'm going to a new sound doesn't mean I leave everything behind. You know, it's still it's inside, and there's a reason that we are here now and we have these experiences, and I think this also culminate in those next stages. But yeah, I come from kind of a musical environment. Like my father is a composer and my mother is a painter, so it's a very artistic, creative environment. And so I got in touch with music quite a lot, and like also the emotional bandwidth and the expressivity. It was also connected to theater. My father worked with theater group, so I went a lot to these repetitions, to these shows, and music, of course, could really guide and bring people into different stages, and so I come really from that musical idea. But I have to say that during my life, I really changed always the meaning of sound, or because music is perhaps organized sound, right? Melodies, rhythms. Like how I perceive sound changed during growing up, during also my studies later, which is all sound related. So for instance, I studied music and technology for my bachelor, and it was really to build tools to express sound environment. I was really thinking also about space a lot, sound and space, and I really realized also that sound can be something more like something. I mean, it's very qualitative, it's quite hard and experiential to explain. So sound became something more tangible at some point, something more physical, something more that evokes certain interior modalities where I could like express myself through sounds by placing them in space and reflect myself through those sounds. So and now I'm actually to a point, and I think that syndicate of sound and space, it is really also is all, again, a kind of a bridge that goes from the traditional thinking of sound as something that just coming on the air where we can listen to and we experience it. That sound is much more fundamental and much more like constructing our reality as we speak.
of sound being more than something, just
Uh-huh.
something we hear with the ears, but something that we experience.
Yes. Yes. So, like I said, my previous sound was more creative, more artistic. So I really could experiment with sound, like in what can sound be. And I have explored it in many ways. And I really, through these experiments, I would say these are kind of, you could see more as like projects that I did with an audience, like maybe in exhibitions or in festivals or like these artistic performative installative situations. And through these experiences I really get to know sound as something which also contains information, like memory, for instance. Like if we hear a sound again, we can travel basically back to that time where we sounded here. So it has different dimensions.
We heard when we were kids, or when we were teenagers, or even just a year ago, and
Yeah.
we can almost feel what it felt to be
Yeah.
that state of being. Is that what you're referring to?
Exactly. So it has some kind of semantic effect, but also not only in the terms of memory, but also in the terms of perception. For instance, when a sound moves in the back of the space and go around you, you really have the feeling that like an entity is there, or entity is doing something. And with these sound environments, I could really explore what sound and perception could do. Like, for instance, I work a lot with multi-channels. So there's different loudspeakers in the space. So we know actually more the stereo, right, left and right. But here you have speakers in the corners and maybe even in the elevations or even in the height. And I experienced with my perception that I really could construct spaces within space. So for instance, like a wall that you could push out of the actual physical space, and you had the feeling that the space was growing bigger or even very small.
Standing there, feeling that the space around you is growing
Mhm.
larger just through the sound that you're constructing.
Exactly. So your physical body is just in place, but your mind is really creating these kind of different structures and even also objects, like you could place virtual objects in the space where they kind of a choreography emerges, where things start to move and talk and change their positions, and this whole spatial dramaturgy appears only by you navigating it with your mind, basically your perception, and you create these narratives. So I saw sound something way more architectural or spatial, or yeah, and I could experiment with that in this artistic context.
I think this is a very interesting idea, and where I hear you pushing the boundary, which is it's not just a memory, but it's also a physical and architecture.
Imagine these technological frameworks, because the technology, of course, is very important to explore. So let us go to a space where we have these loudspeakers, and there's also microphones built in who can record, right? So basically, what can happen is that things are recorded in that space, like activities, and they kind of come back in different moments in time. So, for instance, record something, there was an activity, and then it comes back in time. And then we automatically understand, like, oh, this is me doing that before, right? Because we have this kind of recognition, which is also a very important part, that we can recognize ourselves in that process. So there's some kind of feedback of recording, placing it back in the space, and therefore kind of we come into this space where things are altered, things are modified, even things can happen in different speeds. Like, for instance, the thing was recorded, but it's playback a little bit slower or a little bit faster. So it kind of destabilizes that this temporality, and by doing that simultaneously in different places in the space, you get this kind of fluidity. And this is for me a very remarkable experience, where we kind of, yeah, things start to destabilize, and there you kind of jump in with your own kind of attention, where you can navigate through these spaces, build those relationships with those activities, and with that, I think a whole cognitive kind of thing emerges, where our thoughts and our feelings kind of reflect those modalities, those different sounds, and here we can learn something, like we can repeat something, we can reiterate something, to reflect something. And I found very amazing.
Can you give me some examples? Like what did that look like for you or for other people?
So this, I would say, was always kind of the goal I had with these frameworks, is that people walk out and they learn something or they got something, but it's all through their own process, you know. So you let people in, and it's like, it's the space is generative. People can decide where they are with their body. They can walk freely around, and that they come out and they have a story, even if it's like, I had one experience in 2017, that was the father of my friend, and a childhood friend, and he was not really into that artistic thing, and he walked out of the space and he said, "You're a psychopath." And it was like, and 6 7 years later, he was still always talking about this moment. Like, I don't understand what happened there, but it provoked some kind of thinking. It provoked some kind of reflection, and I think that is something very valuable, that it can do something. So with
So, what do you think this insight or this paradigm that you're pushing, where do you think it can be used to help us, to help people to experience reality in a different way? And why do you think it's significant in this changing world as we start to explore our own inner worlds more deeply? Where do you see this comes in?
Yes, I think not necessarily that I'm pushing the paradigm. I think also, so it is a much larger movement that we all kind of contribute to. And even through the problems we face in the world, there are somehow lessons inside, and they tell us something needs to change, something we are not doing well. And so I see that we have been constructing a world, and I think it's also somehow very legitimate that we had to come to that point, that we constructed a world which is very material oriented. So, and I believe that actually it was not always like that. That we also evolve, our consciousness evolves, like how we interact with our world, the relationships we make between ourselves and the world, our thoughts, and that these are all also evolving. And I think that we came to a point where we evolved our material outer world so well. We have all these very sophisticated technologies, these abstractions where we can measure things, these formulas to build our scientific world, but that we actually forgot basically to develop we lost actually that kind of connection to our inner world. So we focus really on that outer world, but we lost that inner connection. But like I said, I think it's also for a reason, because we really developed that rational capacity. Like, we really develop our clear consciousness somehow. But now I think it's time to refocus on the inner world with those new capacities we built. And technology, I think, is somehow the guide. I mean, the technology represents like our time, our age, like, that we now work with computers and coordinate everything, internet, and that really constructs or who we are. And so I believe if we build technologies that really point to that inner world and make us learn about what happens inside and how things work, that we invite somehow that more spiritual nature that we have. And I believe the spiritual nature is that inner world, which are our thoughts, our feelings, our decisions that we make to do something from inside, that we have these intuitions, that we start to recognize these again and nourish them again, or give them a place in our society. I think that is that fundamental shift of paradigm, that we reintegrate the inner world in that rational, clear consciousness that we developed. And I think that sound and more ephemeral substances like light, sound, more non-physical, that they actually can interface that inner world and let those non-physical, that also is your thoughts, your feelings, speak to us and reflect through us through these technologies, where we can somehow place our memory or feelings outside and remember things. And
I mean, when I hear you speak, it definitely resonates with, well, not just the world I'm interacting with it, but also, studying macro history trends. And I think there's a macro historian, Sorkin, who talks about us moving from the sensate to the ideational. And the sensate world is the one that you just described, the one that we're maybe used to interacting, where it's working with our senses and what we can see and what we can measure. There's certainly several scholars that have pointed out to where our current knowledge regimes come from, largely coming from this moment of the Enlightenment period in Europe and the start of scientific inquiry. And if you can measure it, then it's real. And really prioritizing this word that we can measure through data and through our tools of measurement. And it's interesting that, various macro historians as well have pointed out to how things move in cycles and moving, whether it's over hundreds of years or 500 years, depending on what your reference of time is. Michelle Bowens, who I've had on the podcast before, talks about this cosmolocal transition and us being in this moment of transition, moving away um, from these old worlds, the older systems. And what's really interesting hearing you talk about, and I want to hear you share a little bit more on this idea of how technology can play a role in how we interact with our inner worlds. But it's interesting that listening to, for instance, another macro historian, Sarkar, talk about how our ways of knowing have to change in order for us to make this transition to the next paradigm. And so when I hear you talk about um, technology playing
Yes,
this
exactly.
interfacing role, that's really interesting to me because today the criticism of technology might be that it's actually taking us deeper into it's taking us
Yes.
maybe away from our senses in a way where we're really getting
Yeah,
caught up in the mind and less able to sense into our
exactly.
body, which is really crucial for us to feel into something that is not sensate. So yeah, walk me through. What are your reflections on this, and how can we start to actually purpose technology towards interacting with our inner worlds and actually get some assistance in this journey?
Yeah, I think you said a lot of very profound things just now, and also who you referenced to, thoughts they brought into it. I think that cyclical nature we have is to understand that is very essential to really understand where are we, everything happens in different levels but in the same kind of degrees, right? And even our material world, there are very low vibrations that create this physicality, but there's also the higher vibrations, which is our thoughts, or maybe sound or light first, and then go more to thoughts. So but the cyclical nature, and I think more in the evolution, when we more kind of spread it out to understand how we got here, that we went through some cultural epochs, let's say, and each cultural epoch we had a different consciousness, a different way to interact with our world. I would not to go too deep into it, but what I understand is that we had a way more, obviously, a connection through to the spiritual world, to gods, and we see that in different paradigms, in the ancient Indian to the Persian paradigm to Egypt, that they had connections to kind of different deities, entities that are more spiritual. And during the Egyptian time, we can see that the science emerged, that through reading the stars, and maybe it's the will of the gods, we kind of brought that spiritual to the earth and created our tools to like you said, measure things. We kind of brought the spirit inside of our material world, and I think that when it kind of went to a bit of destructive almost tendency, that we started to want to own those structures, own those systems, and we start to also fight for those systems and ideas. I think that each epoch has somehow its own buildings, like its own structures, and I think definitely the pyramid is like one of those. I think this time maybe it's the skyscraper, is like this kind of vertical approach, and the squared, systematic, very overly rational. But yeah, definitely it means that we also need a kind of a new building somehow, that really represents that movement, that we went from that spiritual into the material, into the physical, and we basically locked it, I think, like into with our intellect. We really brought it inside, and we don't let it move freely anymore. We see it in our technologies, that all these natural mechanisms, all these natural flows that are in the technology, electricity, the water, the gas, that all moves through structures that we are making, but actually it wants to burst out, it wants to go wherever it wants. And so I think these new technologies, they do something very different than we are used to. Like you said, like we have not a really good relationship with our current technology, because it takes us away from the now, the immediate environment. We're disconnected with our, like, your concentration is crumbling. And basically I feel that these technologies, the new technologies, they have to liberate something. They have to liberate that natural force that wants to go everywhere back out of matter. And I think the technology would help us to do it. And it's very objectively, like, it's like, I think that is also very important, that we really, from that rational capacity, really in our daily consciousness. And that's also different from these older epochs that, for instance, in the ancient Indian time, we saw the outer world, the material world, as illusion, the Maya. And the inner world was the real world, you know? It was kind of through meditation, through deep dreamlike states that we connected to those spiritual realms. The new form, and I think we don't go back to older times. We have developed something that we need to also utilize, that rational capacity, but through that rational clear consciousness, that we reintegrate that spiritual, which has very different properties than our material world. It is not deterministic, it's indeterministic, it's more dynamic, it's more adaptive, it's even recognizes itself.
You mentioned something that caught my attention, this idea of spirit being trapped, energy being trapped, and not being able to move fluidly. Like it wants to expand everywhere, you said. It wants to move, but it's being trapped by our current structures. Yeah, help me understand that more. How do you see this stuckness and reflecting maybe our current reality? And how do you see this energy flowing out? What is this?
Yeah.
What is it like?
During my artistic journey, the previous sound, I really try to infuse the technologies with kind of randomness, irregularities, let it make decisions on itself, let it move in a certain way which I cannot really control. And by doing that, I really found a very interesting dynamic that it really was telling me things, like telling me information, and it really want to show. I don't say that without my consciousness, without me making those interpretations, it would exist. Like, I'm still making meaning out of it, right? And I think that is very important. But so I developed somehow an idea of a free flowing technology. So that's a kind of a new type of technology where also the relationship between the user and the technology is completely different. Like, we know now we talk mostly about user experience, there's always this kind of, we are the user, the technology, we can change and we move. This is actually reflects also again on those natural forces that we kind of control. But with this new technology, we cannot use, basically. It always transforms, it always adapts, it always responds to these activities that happens in that now, in that moment. So it is responding to the immediate environment. We can see through these technologies what is happening, how we respond. It kind of circulates the energy where we can reflect and we can see ourselves, and it really brings us back to that moment, to that now. I think that is really important, and that the previous technologies, it's really bring us more to different spaces where I guess the intention and the meaning gets also lost, and we also don't really know anymore, like, what is the intention behind, and it's all abstractions. And I think that intuitive knowing that is more in that moment is something we must develop, in the new paradigm that also.
So, what I'm hearing is this creation of technology that's helping us to actually be more in the present, to helping us actually to connect more with our inner worlds and feel more presence, feel the guidance of spirit, and in that create almost from a vicious cycle where technology is removing us from the present. And therefore, in this state of being removed from the present, creating new technologies uh, which are further reinforcing this vicious cycle. As Heidegger would say, violently reshaping nature to suit the needs of our rational mind and what it perceives it needs. But what I'm hearing is where we are able to create technology that is changing this cycle, helping people to connect more into intuition.
And I think it's even way more radical than we even can imagine. And in this, I would also say that we somehow would need also to confess that we really don't understand it, and that we also somehow our senses has so built towards this moment how we interface that or reality, that material world, that we really also have to reshape and rebuild those senses and that sensorium we have. And through that, and it's a process of education, basically it's a process of learning, that we can start to integrate it. And I think then also these new structures that we envision, which is more decentralized, and they can only really work when we are also really back to that center, that we also really are able to transform. And I think that's also a collective process. That's why I say, like, I think individually we can maybe touch those through meditations, through these kind of deeper practices. But I think that's just kind of a memory of that ancient Indian time where we had this kind of dreamlike consciousness and this connection to the spiritual world. But to really evolve, we would need to have also that capacity of understanding that we are not only material beings, we are not only bodies, we are also have these different bodies that are non-physical.
I think the challenge that I seem to see is that while a lot of us, or more and more people, are recognizing, as you say, we are more than just bodies, and Indian traditions of
Yeah.
Advaita or non-duality, and bringing into this recognition of, you know, the true self in Buddhist language versus the false non-self, which is perhaps the world that we're very much occupying today. And the challenge can be is that in this world that we're living in, it's very dense. It feels very heavy, and intellectually we are able to recognize things like non-duality, able to recognize interconnectedness between nature, between all of us. We seem to be stuck in this very rational, intellectual awareness. And some of us, and perhaps we can talk about this more about, through meditation or through other ways of being, getting out of the mind, we're able to explore these different levels of consciousness. But by and large, it feels like it takes each person to really go through this journey of discovery. And let's put in the hard yards, put in the work to be able to then unlearn some of the past conditioning that we all have through society. But, and this is where I'm curious now is to hear what you're saying, is that if in the same way we have tools that have helped us in different ways, helped us to farm, help us to create structures and buildings, and help us to understand different aspects, we can also have technology, and maybe this is what you've been exploring through sound, to actually connect into consciousness, connect into spirit in ways that might actually help
Yeah.
catalyze this transition. Because if we're dealing with all these very structural challenges, this very dense, heavy that we deal with in our reality, we need some assistance from some way, and spirit can come in, and perhaps through these kinds of technologies, and sound being one which you've been exploring, we can start to awaken more.
Yeah, ourselves as well. And I think that's also where I come through the new sound. And this is also that new mentality that I felt like how it can really, how can this emerge? I think conceptually, and I would say that is the indirect knowing, we already are there somehow. The seed is already there, but how it's really going to manifest, how we can really get this thing going, you know? And I think also it needs to really expand to like mass scale and population, that actually not only a small group of people are understanding this, connecting to this, but it really happens from that the broader society, the society at large, and how we can reach them, how we can bring those technologies to them.
So the question that's coming to me now is how did you get to this point? How did you start to feel? What was your journey of awakening to see this reality of energy being stuck, wanting to liberate?
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about what you learned.
And now we're going really into a rabbit hole, I think, but I will do it, and I think it's also quite fun and interesting. The first framework that I have built with these technologies that kind of executed that feedback, the microphone speakers. This was actually a turning point in my life. Is that the years before and it started actually the corona, the pandemic. The start of the pandemic, I was really like catalyzed into the deep down. It's like I had few things. I had a huge allergic reaction on the day of the first lockdown. Also, my ex-girlfriend was leaving me, and I was really like in a really deep state. And I found somehow that my way back through kind of creativity, but also kind of more esoteric ideas. And I was really like reading a lot about energies, about planets. And I even had like 7 radios, which was each radio was connecting to a planet. And through these radios, I could kind of channel the energies, and it really worked. But it was like my mind had connect this connection, this meaning, and it was guiding me. And it was then the radio turns on all of a sudden out of itself and say things to me from a random channel, which I was like, oh, whoa. And then anticipating on that. And my journey was really like almost like surrendering to those forces. I even didn't make decisions anymore myself. I had an app who made my decisions. I just randomly click and it says, yeah, you should do this or do that. And this kind of really, I really lost completely touch with the earth. And I was really only in that domain. And then this installation, that first framework, which was in Berlin in a spatial sound system, very sophisticated, 60 channels of speakers in elevation space, where I create this environment. And what happened there is I created this fictional narrative, like a mythology, basically. It's funny that I graduated my master degree, which was in sound studies and sonic arts, yeah, with a fictional narrative. Everyone makes papers about methodology, structures, and I came with like a fiction story about the dragon, about the character in the year 2134, and it built it up towards this installation. And what happened on the third day is that I basically somehow had a death moment, and people found me in the installation on the floor like lifeless, and they took me out. And this was the moment that I returned somehow back to earth. And that moment, and it was connected to this mythology with a dragon, and it left also an egg behind. And that egg was somehow eventually I brought to Budapest, which also started the Syndicate of Sound and Space, which the egg bursted open, that became Holos, the first technological framework. So it was all this mythology, very charged, energetical journey. And but with that, I also, like I said, I distanced myself a lot with the reality, basically, with that rational consciousness, and I lose a lot of friends. I lose a lot of.
I'm curious, did the structure that you created, did that play a role itself in altering
Yeah,
your sense of consciousness?
totally. Yes, yes, yes. I mean, through the technology, I really reinvented myself and started to understand like who am I and where do I come from? Why did I experience certain things in my past, and what do I need to do, and why I have this engineering mindset. And it really made me realize like, yeah, I have to bring those things that I learned, those experiences together. And even I had to realize that later on, after all these things, and also with Syndicate of Sound and Space, which had this whole 1.5 year journey where this technology was running 24/7 for like almost a year nonstop. And afterwards, it didn't continue, and I went to India actually, and I also had this idea like maybe I need to find someone. Or I was also reading a lot, and the guru, the teacher, student dynamic, and I was just going there to a very sacred place. I was even thinking like maybe I will never come back, and this is what I need to do. And I climbed a mountain, a sacred mountain it's called Girnar, and I climbed 10,000 steps in Gujarat. Very hard to reach. I climbed 10,000 steps, and on that top, I realized that I need to come back to my roots, where I come from, through that rational upbringing, but also that interest in spirituality, and that these things, how to bring those together and start to develop and integrate it more into that society we know. So to able to also communicate it. So yeah, now I'm actually in a very different state where I perceive the technology not as somehow prophetic thing to understand myself, but to build a very accessible, like where all these experiences come together into an object and device where people can go into that journey and to explore themselves, recognize themselves, learn from experiences. So I have been going through it somehow through the technology and changed myself through those experiences with technology where I would love to bring that understanding and that journey, which was so precious and so rich and so alive, to bring that to the world and to make it something like a tool where we can start to connect to ourselves in different ways. But it's also really in free choice. Like I don't impose anything on people, and it's all their own unique journey. And I realized also that guru is not there, it's within, and we can teach, self-educate through being more tuned and connected to that inner world which moves us, which has been grown through the experiences we had, and that in that information we can develop somehow a more sensibility to perhaps more non-physical realities. But like I said, I think we are in a collective evolution that before we not collectively evolve into it, it doesn't really has a meaning. So I hope these technologies can kind of catalyze a curve of self-exploration, of basically building a new sensorium to integrate the inner world and into that.
Thank you for sharing this journey that you went on through intimately. And I mean, I have no doubt that you would have undergone many profound shifts through this. I'm curious if, in addition to what you're building, if you've seen what are the ways where technology has helped you to connect with consciousness. Do you see any other objects out there? What other people might be building that might be reflecting also this similar this.
I definitely think that there's more people working on these interfaces, like interfaces between consciousness, that first order template of how we experience the world and our reality, like through technology. So I'm definitely sure. I don't know many people, unfortunately. I think it's very decentralized.
Philosophically, what was coming to me is there's a Daoist perspective on AI and technology, which has been one of the explorations that I've been looking at, where this question of what is the role of technology is posed. And in the Taoist view, which is everything is about having us being in connection with the Tao, or being in connection with nature. And that is the sort of highest state of being that each human should aspire to. And the role of technology as being something that helps us be more connected to nature rather than being disconnected. And there's a scholar, a Hong Kong based scholar, Yu Kuei, and he has a framework that's quite interesting where he talks about the Tao and Qi. And Qi is a very Confucius reference to how in the Confucian system they use tools to be more in connected or more harmony with the universe. And so in the Confucian system of Li, there's different arrangements and different altars, and you use essentially objects, but let's call them, material objects, to be in more harmony with the universe. What I'm hearing you is when I'm hearing you speak and talk about technology, it's really about uh, technology being helping us be more connected to the Tao, to be more connected with the universe. And from that space, perhaps what my hope is that we're able to build more technology then that helps us to be more connected. And then that what I'm hearing in there is that sort of catalyzes this new paradigm where technology is getting us more in connected to our true nature, with spirit, with our intuition, rather than separating from it, which is now.
Yes. And I think for that, we also need to leave things behind somehow. And I think that, for instance, I think that we have this kind of striving also for personal complex, that our personality has certain position in the society. We educate ourselves, become a bit more intellectual, get higher jobs and everything. But what we are talking now about is something way more something that connects us all and not separates us from that moment, from each other. So to integrate those principles, the principles of the spirit, perhaps that dynamic, that that more unifying, that these are principles we have to also foster in the systems we build around those technologies, and how we position ourselves in accord with those technologies, that we really also, these technologies, that they don't have too much or maybe even none identity in itself that we as designers put into it, but that it has this free flow dynamic, that everyone who work with those technologies, that these technologies also adapt to that unique structure, that unique character that's working with those technologies, and doesn't need to go through all these subjective layers, but really goes directly to that inner world.
So, walk me through or help me understand this new process then. This new process of creating technology, be as specific as you like around what kind of new objects or technologies could
Yeah,
look like, just to help us better
yeah,
understand what this actually could look like. Because like right now when I think of
yeah,
technology, I'm thinking, okay,
yeah,
I've got my phone, which has apps on it. I can go and connect to friends. I can go read the news. I can go watch movies. Or today I can use, something a tool like ChatGPT, which can help me query with this collective knowledge systems and understand. And so when I'm thinking about my interaction with technology from this user perspective, this is my journey. How are you envisaging this new paradigm? What does it look like?
yeah. So we already talked about that there is some kind of material nature of technology. So we have it like physically in our hand. Like you said, your phone. You already travel through many spaces when you explained your relation with your phone, obviously. Like you're connecting to different people, different digital spaces and everything. But like we mentioned before, like something trapped in the material world, something spiritual. So I believe that from the earth, from that passivity, from that physical structure, something needs to again burst out, liberate. So these technologies, I call this, so these free flowing technologies. So they have somehow, they are adaptive, they are dynamic. You don't control, you cannot go to another place, but it's always kind of responding to the environment, so in real time. Even it could also eventually expand to also different ways of communicating those experiences we have in real time with other people who has these technologies, or maybe even embodied. So I envision that the spaces of that new paradigm would also make us able to embody those experiences, to to collect our inner world, to record. Basically, it's also a whole new approach on value, that our value will be more an experiential value. It's records instances which have, and that I think is that quality of sound, that it has information encoded in the waves. So you can encode basically the spatial information in waves, but also the somehow the dynamic of how someone feel, or so they're kind of more subtle qualities, and that these can be packages that we can also exchange, and by doing that to also start to understand somehow that nature we share, and how unique we are, but at the same time how connected things are. So this new technology, they have some basic principles, and also the interaction with them has some kind of basic rules, or maybe rules, it's more like fundamental, like principles. So I'll tell you a bit about those. Um, so, for instance, one of the most important principles that this technology has is the idea of holography, also the idea of holos, the all unity. But holography, we have a bit of misconception that we think, holography is like a 3D projection, right? Yeah, yeah, some kind of like you have like a disc, and out of like a 3D projection emerges, and we can send messages through that 3D projections. But I think that's not really holographic. Holographic means that all the particles, all the information that is inside of the device contains actually the information of the whole. So it's holographic. So, for instance, these particles, which are kind of, they know them itself. The universe knows itself, basically. Like our parts in our body, it's actually, we come maybe to a point that we understand that we are holographic ourselves, that we are, that are the gnomes that we have in our body. Like when you take something out, it will understand something is missing, and it repairs itself,
This
and like it
inner
knows
intelligence of
itself, basically. It knows Yeah, organic intelligence. And I think this is also very important to also distinguish from artificial intelligence. That artificial intelligence, computers don't know themselves. They work on algorithms, syntax, switches going on and off. If you take one transistor out, the device stops to work. And it's not that you take it out and it grows back. That's not going to happen in a computer. And that it's a whole different kind of intelligence and liveliness, an inspirited process of one knowing itself.
So self-aware, a conscious, what truly conscious technology is what you're
Yeah,
saying.
yeah, yeah. So basically, the spirit that flows through the technology, not the technology itself, because this works again on these switches and that kind of more causal structure, but that it kind of mediates the spirit to flow through, and it kind of then translates it or transforms it. That's also what media do, right? It translates something to something else. That it translates that language of the spirit into a tangible experience that we can understand what it does or what it says. So basically, what is very important that it has not only an output but also an input. It can listen to the environment, it can receive, but it can also activate. It brings information back, and this is kind of a circular process which is very fundamental in these technologies. And then there's some steps that how we would interact with it as.
I mean, I just thought of this. So speaking of technologies, like I have a pyramid here. You have a cube.
Look, I have a cube.
Well, I have a pyramid, and
Tell me
then
about the pyramid.
I
Amazing, I
have
love it.
some tools that help me feel more into
Mhm.
intuition. Or in some cases, I've heard of
Uh-huh.
people use pendulums, and I've used them myself, which is can help me indicate a decision whether one is to do something or not. But you're having difficulty to
Yeah.
hear the spirit myself, and so you can use the pendulum to maybe help you understand what spirit is trying to tell you versus what the rational mind might be, clouding, or what the rational mind might be telling me. This is the extent to which I've seen something like this of a technology that's allowing a material form, let's call it, that's allowing spirit to manifest. And so is what you're saying
Yeah.
something similar, but perhaps on the next level.
Yes, yes. But I think also that in this way you propose, and I definitely it's the same like also make it do a tarot or something, right? Or do like this. It's like it's also really related to our own conception, the meaning we create, and I think we should not separate those physical and spiritual with also that inner reality. They are in constant inter exchange or relationship interaction. But I think with these technologies is that like we also dealing with space, right? We are configuring our orientation navigation in space. We have a front, we have a back, left, right. So the space is somehow an area where things emerge and things can expand. And so I think the spatialness of the technology and that we can embody, we can see ourselves inside, we can walk inside or walk around it. I think this is gives a lot of extra dimension. Then also, so I say already a few things. So at the foundation you have the technology, then you have this embodiment, the embodiment that we can walk around, we can experience. We have a free choice of how to navigate. But most importantly, is that we also start to recognize ourselves in the technology, that we feel we are part of it. We can see ourselves outside of ourselves and interact with ourselves, with our inside collapse out, and we can even multiplicate. This is also an experience I had that through different 3D shapes of myself, previous selves walking through the room. I could have 12 times myself basically in the room walking around. And I was experiencing that like, whoa, what is this? And that we reflect ourselves through ourselves, and the images it produces creates meaning, and that meaning can guide us to understand ourselves. And this is a purely unique, private. This cannot even be altered by someone. It's like it's you, and I cannot control your inner world. It's yours. You
So
are so. Yeah.
these kinds of I think these kinds of what you're describing is best experienced, and there's always challenges to understand it intellectually. Can I invite you to co-imagine with me?
Yeah.
what would in let's take us to the future, take us through maybe a realistic timeline based on where you see these technologies that you're building or the way you see the trajectory. Shall we go 5 years or 10 years? Perhaps let's keep it 5 to 10. Draw us some scenarios then of how you see yourself or people using this in their day to day. What would a day look like where I had some of these access to this technology with me? What would my life look like in terms of my day to day, in terms of maybe how I interacted with my relationships, I interacted with friends, or I connected with people in different spaces, and then what might the world that I'm operating in, what might that look like, where we've made this paradigm shift and we're making this transition to a space, to a time when our ways of knowing are more integrated with consciousness and with these new ways of sensing spirit. Paint some, yeah, let's co-imagine, let's have fun with it. Tell me what will my day look like?
First of all, I have to say that we enter the domain of the future, so I have to say everything is speculative. So, so I can maybe also talk from my wish, like how I wish it to be.
A more light forest future.
So I think that what I wish is that we start to live and we start to feel alive and we start to connecting with things that are connected with life. And I think that actually we are not really aware that our society basically built on concepts that are dead. And that we start to that process of understanding is also part of that shift of paradigm, is that basically all science, like we said, outer things measuring, we're actually measuring things that have no life form. They don't grow, they don't move, they don't are dynamic, they don't create. So in that future, 10, 15 years, that's really optimistic. I don't know. I wish it would be there. I even think sometimes that maybe the things I work on, I will not be able to be still alive in this body to really catalyze. And that's also okay, like as long it's part of that process. But I wish that we found ourselves again, that what makes us human, that what makes us alive, what makes us create and what makes us explore and not turn into these automatons where we just have all this repetition behavior for some higher hierarchy that profit from that. But that we have a whole new system of value where the value is based on wholeness, like on somehow liveliness, and that we create somehow a technology or an interface where we can exchange and contribute with our unique qualities to that diversified pool of different interactions where things meet each other and explore each other and can enrich each other and can help each other, and that through technologies it kind of connects, finds the thing we need on the right moment, in the right time, in the right space, and that these technologies can localize what is a person lacking, why it has somehow something, an error, why the soul is distorted, how can we repair that, and that actually the necessary waves, the necessary sounds flow through those technologies to the spaces to basically repair and create somehow a society which is healthy, which is flourishing, which is growing, and I don't think perhaps that maybe our material world, I think it is needed now to basically revert the process of from going from in to out, but back from out to the inner world, like bring back the inner world. Maybe even that we also start to detach ourselves slowly from the material world and basically create a certain new society, a new kingdom around spirit, the things that connect us, and that our whole economy, the whole approach of systems, that they really echo those principles of the spirit, the unifying, the dynamic, the self-exploring. So
And
yeah.
what might be the ways that I'm using technology in this world? Like, what do these devices look like? What is my relationship to technology like?
For instance, that we enter, like I said, like every epoch has somehow its own building. So that also new kind of buildings emerge where high sophisticated technological frameworks are embedded, but it's like identityless. It's like a room without walls. Like it is always adapting to that unique structure of the individual that enters the space to make the structure as harmonious as possible to let the inner world flow out, the spirit flow out and communicate to you, and where we can self-reflect and learn, and that these spaces can also be in real time connected, that we can also mediate those experiences in real time in different spaces, like a network of soul basically, where we, and then these technologies, they are just containers of where this experience can kind of be collected and like as packages, and then can be shared and gifted.
One image that's coming to me when I hear you talk about embodying experiences and being able to share experiences. Like today, we each of us live in our private lives.
Mhm.
Like I'm living in my private mind, my private world, and while we can have empathy for each other, empathy is still quite limited. There's that phrase, put yourself in somebody's shoes, where you try to imagine what it might like to be that person who is lost their job because their boss is racist, or someone who has had their house burnt down by a fire. And everyone who's going through their individual experiences, and we try to have empathy and we try to understand what it might be like to feel like a tree that's been cut down, or to be like a forest that's because without this felt feeling of what it likes, I just feel like I'm another body, another mind who has to care about some other person. But what I'm hearing from you is maybe through these ability to share these embodied experiences, we're actually able to feel more what it's like to be one entity, one Gaia, if you will, one living system, where your experience is my experience and I'm able to feel what you're feeling.
Yeah, exactly. So actually, we come to an understanding that we actually share the same template of subjectivity. And by sharing that, we also understand that when I hurt your subjectivity, then I also do it to myself. So I think also that the thing is that we are intellectually so overdeveloped now with all these inventions, but morally, we are very underdeveloped, and that we can see through the wars, through selfishness, through always wanting personal treasury to make ourselves personally be healthy, have beautiful clothes and beautiful materials. And morally, we will start to evolve as soon we feel the unity in things. Because if we feel the unity in things, then we know that we also do it to ourselves when we
Could
basically
a
do something to
parallel
the outside. Yeah.
example be brought up to something like psychedelics? People talk about substances and substances helping us
Yeah.
to experience reality in different ways. Can you
Yeah.
see, is this a similar example?
I would say that we definitely can reach states, but we are already again going back to that dream hazy kind of psychedelic state. And I think that what I'm talking about is very objective, very real, very conscious, very
More
awake
grounded
in our day to day, not
awareness.
just in moments, not just in flashes of transcendent states. Yeah, yeah, exactly. So when we do a trip, of course, it can give us things are flowing more, things can speak to us. But as long we don't integrate it and we depend on that moment where we take that pill, take that thing, is that yeah, it just stay there. It just
Right, there's
stays there,
that
and we come out of
polarity
it,
up
and
and
we are kind of a
down.
bit tired, and we are back, in that. Exactly. So it's really about to slowly integrate it, slowly create that understanding. And like I said, it has to come from the larger society at large to introduce slowly those technologies, to let people interface it, see how they react. Don't expect that they already go there and immediately. Let the curve, let it evolve as it wants to evolve, and slowly try to make it accessible, simplify it, and yeah, introduce those technologies to educate us from that rational dear wake consciousness.
Let's call it the light forest transition. How do you see the introduction of these technologies come in? Like, what role do schools have to play, or governments? Who are the key actors, and how do they transition this? Also, what about the investment, and how does this creation? Because I think what we sometimes tend to neglect or overlook is that the technology itself is a product of a much larger ecosystem. And so the funding mechanisms, who's funding, the interest of it, the business models, all of this ultimately influence the technology in ways that we are feeling the effects of now. And I feel like we could have this very beautiful consciousness expanding potential that you just talk about, but without the right market structures, without the right business models, I fear this is what tends to happen then is that they get repackaged and the consciousness is pulled out of it.
Yeah.
How do we prevent that?
Yeah. Yeah, I think you're totally right. It's very important that we evolve those from the known, from that what we know so well, all these structures, the commerce, a genuine commerce perhaps, where indeed we people are so connected to kind of this commercial reality of buying things and selling things that also it kind of emerge in there in the supply demand, but also in a different, in maybe a kind of innovative way. So actually, I would really urge us to stop actually talking too much, envisioning too much, being in these kind of concepts too much, but really start to think really clear of how are we going to integrate it, how we can really create that real world impact. And I think for that we really need to understand also traditional things like who are the first people who would buy such a thing? What is the product market fit in the beginning? Don't expect it's already everyone would be interested. How we can kind of with a small bandwidth kind of introduce those maybe in more decentralized new modalities. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the DeFi space, and in the DAOs, and I think that carries so much beautiful potential to also kind of invent new kind of funding mechanisms to get these technologies off the ground. And I think also that, for instance, blockchain and like transparency, cryptography, that people can see what do they invest in, what do they contribute, where do the goods, how do the goods, physical goods, come to the right place in the right time, who is joining in, what is the value creation of those experiential packages, and how that can be maybe translated into real value or maybe even currencies, and that we really have to think indeed about really how the mechanisms that real world ground the floor is created to make these technologies also come into our world. And I think that it's very important to also deploy the things we learned in our commerce, that for instance you first make some MVPs of the product and you have some first tests and maybe some early adopters emerges to invest some first money or be part of that growth of the technology, and then slowly start to sell prototypes of technology, and not already jump full force into that big large vision, and to really build those small steps and drive an engine of growth where it's sustainable, the growth, and not that maybe there's a grant of 10,000 that you can, or 100,000 you can create amazing things and invest, but then it falls away. And that's also, I think, the risk, is that how can such a thing be sustainable? How can the engine of growth really can be has a long-term vision? Because we have to educate, we have to slowly develop into it, and if it's just a hype, yeah, the next year it's gone. And so to really think very carefully about those mechanisms and the governance of who is working and how also the profits or the income is distributed, that people who work on it also have something, get something back, and to really think about all of these things. I think it's very, very important. And I think that's where I'm now also moving into that space of, to the text I am finished now. The writing is really, I see it myself actually as really the last intellectual endeavor that I make, also from my academic background, and to really, okay, write it one more time down. And now it's time just to for action, go into the market, become an entrepreneur, create the interests, find the people who work on it together, the mechanisms envision the mechanisms that generate or drives the process. So this is where I am actually now, and I'm at the start of this.
Well, Neil, I have to
Yeah.
say, when we started this journey, I said we'll be walking through the forest and going through paths that I don't often go to or fully understand, and I think that's definitely happened. Certainly, I would say in this world, as I walk around and I try to feel more into my connection with the forest and my connection with nature, it's not easy. And there are so many distractions, and oftentimes technology is that mediating or that distraction of pulling my attention away from myself. And I speak to many people, and it's often very difficult to find people who see technology actually playing a role in actually expanding our consciousness. Yet, I think, as you've described through your own experience, that maybe this is possible, and actually bringing in technology into the next paradigm, not just as a way in not to see it in the same way that it used to be or it is now, but perhaps in ways that it was many hundreds of years ago in the past, and perhaps bringing this back now in ways that it can actually guide us, it can help us expand our consciousness, and can help catalyze this light forest regeneration, if you will, where we are living in more harmony with each other, in more harmony with the universe, and expanding our ways of knowing and understanding with these objects, whether it's in the form of a cube or in the form of a a spatial sound, space that's constructed, however else that you're going about this. I think it's certainly very interesting, and I think our world, I can certainly see the need for this kinds of technology to come in and to help regenerate our lives and regenerate the planet. It certainly seems like a worthy endeavor, and I think as you are on this entrepreneurial journey or the start of it, I wish you well. Help bring the spirit into this material form in a very new way. So sounds not easy, and from the creation perspective to the market and the business
Yes,
model. So
of course.
I think it's been, yeah, very insightful and
Yes,
to
yes,
learn about
yes.
what this possibility might look like.
Yes, yes, yes. And I think also like we talk about something which is experiential, first order. So it comes from that consciousness that for how we mediate with our reality is that we are now also again talking in concepts and in words. And I think the only value is really to really experience it and to really bring it into our hands and bring it to the space and bring people and connect to, and that we actually do trying something impossible now, basically to understand it through this conversation. But I'm very hopeful, and the light is definitely already going through the trees in the forest. That I see the where it wants to go, and even if it doesn't, because this is speculative, doesn't happen in this lifetime, but we can contribute to it, to this process. Then I feel already very grateful. And
Well, final question before we end this podcast. Where are the places in the world where you feel the best vibration?
I think it has to come from inside. The inside space, the interior is the space where the tuning happens, and that eventually, if you can navigate that inner world, that you can even from a chair make the amazing travels and go anywhere you would
Okay.
like to go.
Well,
So
on that note, thank
maybe
you
the
so
chair.
much for sharing.
Thank you very much. From the beginning, it was already really pleasure to do this with you, and yeah, very calm I feel by doing this conversation.
Yes.
Yeah,
Thank you,
appreciate it a lot.
Neil.
Thank you
Good
so
luck.
much, and good
Bye
you
bye.
do this. Amazing.